In the next few exercises, we are going to be creating this web page right here. This web page takes advantage of quite a few CSS3 features, such as multiple background images, box, shadow, and multiple borders being applied to elements. The page that we're going to start with looks like this. So we're just going to start with a really basic page. And I'll show you the HTML. The HTML is very simple. It's just an HTML5 document. It links out to an external style sheet. We'll be using an external style sheet for this exercise. Then I have a div with an ID of container. This wraps around everything on my page. I have one article tag, and the article tag contains an H1 and several paragraphs. That's it. Our beginning CSS is also fairly simple. I have my HTML5 selector that turns the HTML5 elements to block level. I have a universal selector that zeroes out padding and margin. I have a rule on the HTML and the body that zeroes out the padding and margin, sets the width and the height to 100%. This will become important when we want to get this full width page to display correctly. Then I have a rule on the HTML that sets the background color to this pale blue. And I have some rules on my body tag that just set some font stylings. And I have some rules on the H1 and on the paragraph tag. Before we jump into actually coding the page, I just wanted to show you the images that we're going to be working with. I have several images that I've created for this lesson. They are all ping images and they're all on transparent backgrounds, and this is what they look like. I have a mountains 2, I have a mountains 1, I have a hills, I have a file called cloud scatter, I have a file called cloud main, and I have a file called birds. Those are the elements that I have separated and saved out as pings. Originally, I created a mock-up in a graphic editor. I happen to use Photoshop. This was my original mock-up, so this is where I designed all of the elements, placed them into the appropriate spots, and kind of got a bead on how I wanted the layout to look, so that when I actually built the page and turned it into an HTML document, I had some direction. You can see the similarities to my original mock-up. Now, on this version, I added some multiple borders and some things that weren't in my original mock-up. That's going to be in part 2 of our lesson. Without further ado, let's get started in coding up these background images and adding multiple background images. Multiple background images are actually surprisingly easy to apply to a page. We'll begin by augmenting the CSS. So we already have some rules on our body tag right here. I'm going to start off by adding a background image that is going to provide the fallback content in case the user is on a browser that does not support the multiple background image feature. For this, I'm just going to write background, and then I'm going to pass on shorthand notation to utilize multiple background properties inside of one declaration. For the URL, I'm going to go up out of my style folder. That's where I'm storing my external style sheet. I'm going to go into my images directory, and I'm going to find my mountains, and we'll just have this display mountains1.png. I'm going to position this image horizontally at the center of my page and vertically at the bottom of my page. When you're using keywords like I am right here, the order in which you specify the keywords doesn't matter. I could write bottom and then center, or center and bottom. I recommend, however, that you do write the horizontal position offset first and then the vertical position offset. This is a better practice because when you start using numeric values instead of keyword properties, they always have to be entered with the horizontal and then the vertical offset. So if you just always write horizontal and vertical, I find that it makes it easier to remember the order in which you need to declare these particular values. In addition to doing the offsets, I'm going to have my image repeat in the X direction, which will repeat the image horizontally across the page. If I save my page now and we preview it in the browser, my page now looks like this, and you can see that the mountain graphic has been added to the bottom of the page. If I resize my page and zoom out, you're going to see that the mountain image just continues to repeat horizontally and tile across the bottom portion of the page. This is exactly what I wanted it to do. Now I've created my graphic so it seamlessly tiles, and the page could get as small or as big as it needs to, and this mountain image is just going to repeat across the bottom of the page. We'll just reset this back to 100%. Now let's add multiple background images. The reason that I want to declare the single image first is for a browser that doesn't understand the multiple background images, it's going to hit this rule and display the page as you just saw it in the browser. It will simply ignore the next rule that we're going to specify, so at least the person in the older browser will be able to view some sort of background image. They just won't get as rich of an experience. So to declare multiple background images, we begin the same way. I'm going to use the shorthand of background once again. Inside the URL value, I'm going to put the path to the image that I want to display. The image that I want to display first on the page is going to be my main cloud image. I'm going to center this horizontally, and I'm going to place it at the top of the page, and I'm going to tell it to not repeat. Then, instead of putting a semicolon, which is how we usually separate multiple declarations inside of a CSS rule, I'm going to put a comma. This comma is extremely important if you plan to use multiple background images. You simply separate each background image with a comma. Now these multiple background declarations can be strung together on one long line. You can also put them on separate lines. I tend to put them on a separate line, and I like to indent them just because it keeps my CSS a little bit neater. So once again, I'm going to make another URL declaration. I'm going to point to the next image that I want to display on the page, and for this one I'm going to show my cloud scatter image. And for this image, we're going to, instead of using keywords for position, I'm going to use numeric values. Numeric values can be any unit of measurement that you want. For this exercise, I'm going to use 25% for the horizontal, and I'm going to use 60 pixels for the vertical offset. I'm going to then have this image repeat in the X direction. And for right now, I'm just going to put a semicolon so we can just see what this looks like in the browser. If I save my page and we go look in the browser, you're going to see that now the page displays the cloud images. It is worth noting that the page no longer displays the mountain image, and that's because that first rule that declares the mountain image is being overwritten by the second rule. You probably can't tell just by looking, but remember, when I showed you the images, I have two cloud images. Here's the main cloud image, here's the scatter clouds. So when we look in our browser, here's the main cloud image, and then I have these scatter clouds. If I zoom out on the page, you'll notice that eventually the scatter clouds are going to repeat horizontally across the page. The main cloud only appears one time at the top of the page. I'm going to open up my developer tools just so I can show you how we can adjust the position of the scatter clouds. If I change this to 0% for the horizontal offset, you're going to notice how the left edge of the image is going to line up with the left edge of the body tag. So if I hover over my body, it starts here. This image actually begins with some blank space to the left of it. If I change this horizontal offset to 50%, you're going to see how the position of these clouds change. If I change the vertical offset to 200 pixels, you can see how they move down. You can position this image anywhere you want on the page based on the vertical and horizontal offsets. For this particular exercise, I just simply want to have the image appear offset by 25% horizontally and 60 pixels from the top of the page. So that's what we're going to use on this particular declaration. Let's go back and let's add some additional background images to this page. The next image I'm going to place on the page is going to be the hillside, and I'm going to use hills.ping. I'm going to center these and position them at the bottom of the page, and I'm going to tell these to repeat in the X direction. Now, I need to make sure that I'm separating these by commas. I had put a semicolon in here so we could preview this in the browser, but I need to remember to switch this back to a comma so that the multiple images will display properly on the page. At this point, if we save our page, and let me switch this to a semicolon so I can show you. If I save the page and preview, you're going to see that the hills are going to appear at the bottom of the page. No matter what size my browser window is, the hills are always going to be stuck to the bottom of the page. I'll change this back to a comma and we'll declare a couple of more rules. I'm just going to copy this one to make it a little bit quicker, and we'll change the image here to the mountains 2. And then I'm going to position these at the right bottom, and I'll repeat in X as well. If we save our page and look at it in the browser now, you're going to see that the mountain image is now displaying. The order in which you write your multiple background images is important. The first declaration at the top of the group is going to always appear in front of or at the top of the stack. So it is important that I declare the hills first and then the mountains. That's going to ensure that my hills are going to appear in front of the mountain image. We have one more mountain image to add to this rule. So I'm just going to change this to display the mountain 1 image, and again I want this to be right and bottom, and then I'm going to terminate this by adding my semicolon. I'm now done with the multiple images. So in this particular rule I have 5 images that I'm declaring for the background. If I save the page now and we go look at it in the browser, you're going to see that all of the images are going to display on the page. If I zoom out, you're going to see that I have a seamless graphical interface that's going to work at any size browser window. The images are simply going to tile horizontally if that's what the rule specified. So I can easily have all of the images display in a way that I want, and this gives me a very flexible layout to be able to use on my file. So one more thing I just wanted to point out that we had done in the HTML is we had set the width and the height of the HTML and the body to 100%. This is giving us the flexible layout that always keeps these items at the bottom of the page. If I don't have these declarations in my HTML, let me just show you what happens to our page. I'll delete those and save the page, and if I refresh in the browser, you're going to see that all of the content gets stuck up at the top of the page. The reason that it's doing this is because the height of the page is currently being determined by the content that appears on the page. And since our content ends right here, the bottom of the page is identified at the bottom of the content. Those two properties are very important for us to include in our CSS so that this content always stays at the very bottom of the page. So setting the height to 100% on the HTML and on the body are going to make it exactly 100% regardless of the content. Using CSS3's multiple background images is a flexible way that you can create a versatile web page and ultimately build out a creative solution for your users to enjoy.